Most wars start with a bang, or a treaty violation, or maybe a thoughtfully worded declaration delivered by a man in a powdered wig. My war, the great suburban war of Snapdragon Lane, didn't start with a bang. It started with a whoosh. It's a satisfying sound, the whoosh. It's the sound of 100,000 BTUs of propane roaring to life, a contained dragon's breath that transforms a lump of mud into a piece of art. That sound is the heartbeat of my backyard, the soul of my one true love. A 4-foot-tall, slightly dented Raku kiln I call Bertha. Bertha isn't pretty. She looks like a trash can that lifted weights and got a PhD in thermodynamics. But to me, she's a metal goddess. In a world that had recently decided my talents as a graphic designer were less valuable than an algorithm named Synergy Bot 3000, Bertha was my sanctuary. My corporate career had been streamlined. My motivation had been right-sized. In other words, I was fired via a sterile email, and now my main professional ambition was to not permanently fuse my butt to my couch cushions. Pottery was the answer, not the gentle, spin a pot with your lover while cheesy music plays kind of pottery. I was into Raku. Raku is pottery's pyromaniac cousin. You get a piece of pottery glowing red-hot. We're talking 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. Then you yank it out of the inferno with giant metal tongs and plunge it into a can of combustible material like newspaper or sawdust. The flames, the smoke, the thermal shock. It's a violent, unpredictable, and breathtakingly beautiful process. It's art, forged by fire and chaos. It's also, as I was about to find out, deeply offensive to the delicate ecosystem of a cookie-cutter suburb like Maple Creek Estates. Here, the houses are all painted in shades of ambitious beige and questionable taupe. A lawn gnome that's a little too whimsical can trigger a full-blown HOA investigation. A propane kiln that sounds like a jet engine taking off in a wind tunnel? That's basically a declaration of war. I'd been trying to fly under the radar, firing Bertha only at odd, respectable hours. But today, a gorgeous Saturday afternoon, I was feeling bold. I had a vase that I knew, deep in my soul, was destined for greatness. "All right, Bertha, my fiery queen," I murmured, strapping on my heavy welding gloves and visor. "Let's make some magic. Don't listen to what the neighbors say. You're not an industrial eyesore, you're voluptuous." I cranked the valve, hit the igniter, and whoosh! Bertha roared to life, the air shimmering with heat. I felt that familiar calm settle over me, the focus that only comes when you're handling something hot enough to melt lead, the world and its troubles, the job hunt, the dwindling savings account, the weird noise my refrigerator was making. All faded away. It was just me, the heat, and a soon-to-be glorious piece of pottery. For a solid 45 minutes, I was in a state of pure, unadulterated zen. And then came the knock. It wasn't a friendly knock. It wasn't a, "Can I borrow a cup of sugar?" knock. It was a sharp, triple rap, the kind of knock that carries its own punctuation. Knock, 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 as in, you have sinned. I sighed, the zen bubble popping with a sad little fizz. I carefully set my tongs down, lifted my visor, and trudged through my house to the front door, still wearing my scorched, clay-dusted apron and heavy-duty gloves. I probably looked like a mad scientist who had lost a fight with a pizza oven. I pulled open the door, and there she was. The final boss of suburbia. She was a woman in her 50s, encased in a beige pantsuit so crisp it looked like it could stop a bullet. Her blonde hair was sculpted into a formidable helmet, a coif so rigid that a tropical storm would respectfully divert its course around it. Her expression was a finely calibrated blend of disappointment and condescension, the kind of look usually reserved for a child who has just tried to pay for groceries with a crayon drawing. "Excuse me," she said, her voice as smooth and cold as a granite countertop. "I'm Karen Weatherly from 112 Snapdragon Lane. I don't believe we've been properly introduced." "Oh, I know who you are," my brain screamed. "You're the reason the neighborhood Facebook group has a 12-page, single-spaced document on approved mailbox colors. You're the reason old Mr. Gable had to take down his charmingly crooked birdhouse. You are Karen. Of course you are." "Leo," I said, gesturing to myself with a gloved hand. "From here. Sorry about the getup, in the middle of a thing." Her eyes, the color of a faded tax form, narrowed. "Yes, the thing. That's what I've come to discuss." She took a delicate sniff of the air, as if detecting a foul odor that only she, with her superior olfactory senses, could perceive. "There are fumes coming from your yard, and a rather alarming whooshing sound. It frightened my Shih Tzu, Bartholomew." Bartholomew. Of course her dog was named Bartholomew. I could picture him now, a quivering ball of fluff in a tiny cashmere sweater, traumatized by the distant sounds of artistic expression. "The whoosh is just my kiln," I explained, trying for a friendly, non-threatening tone. "It's a pottery kiln. The fumes are, well, it's a controlled fire. It's propane. Less offensive than most charcoal grills, I promise." "It is an unneighborly nuisance," she declared, the words dropping like little ice cubes. Her gaze flickered past me, towards my backyard, where Bertha was shimmering in the afternoon sun. "And that apparatus," she said, the word dripping with disdain, "is quite frankly an eyesore. It's industrial." "It's art?" I offered, the word coming out as more of a question. That was the wrong thing to say. A flicker of something truly hostile crossed her face. To her, art was clearly a code word for chaos, property value decline, and things that are not beige. "I will be speaking with the Homeowners Association," she announced, her voice leaving no room for negotiation. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, like saying the sun would rise tomorrow. She gave one final, withering glare in Bertha's direction, turned on a sensible heel, and marched back across her unnaturally green lawn, a one-woman army of suburban order. I stood there in my doorway, the heat from the kiln at my back and the icy chill of her disapproval on my face, a strange mix of annoyed and deeply, deeply amused. Bartholomew the Shih Tzu had been frightened. A line had been crossed. The first shot in the war had been fired. A few days later, the second shot arrived in my mailbox. It wasn't a bullet. It was something far more terrifying. A cream-colored heavyweight envelope embossed with the official seal of the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. You could just feel the passive aggression radiating through the paper. This wasn't just a letter. It was a document, a proclamation. I sat at my kitchen table, a cup of lukewarm coffee in hand, and slid it open with a butter knife. The letter inside was a masterpiece of corporate jargon applied to neighborhood squabbles. It was polite, sterile, and utterly soul-crushing. "Dear resident of 118 Snapdragon Lane," it began, not even bothering to use my name. "It has come to the attention of the board that activities are being conducted on your property that are not in compliance with the Maple Creek Estates covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Specifically, we must draw your attention to Article 7, Section B. Prohibition of open-flame hobbyist equipment not customarily associated with residential barbecue or heating activities. Customarily associated? I muttered to the empty room. Bertha feels very customary to me. The letter continued, each word a tiny, paper-cut-sized nail in the coffin of my backyard tranquility. Furthermore, under Article 12, Section D, aesthetic cohesion and property value preservation, any permanent or semi-permanent structure, including but not limited to kilns, forges, or other artisanal apparatus, must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee. It concluded with a brisk, merciless demand that I cease and desist all pyrotechnic activities and remove the offending apparatus immediately, lest I face daily fines and potential liens against my property. A lien. They were threatening to put a lien on my house because they didn't like my kiln. I dropped the letter on the table and picked up my phone, dialing the one person I knew would understand the gravity of the situation. Dave's Data Den. How can I help you? Dave, it's Leo, I said. I got a letter. Apparently my kiln is offensive to aesthetic cohesion. Is that a new brand of paint? There was a long, world-weary sigh from the other end of the line. Dave was a mid-level IT guy who had lived in Maple Creek for 20 years. He was the neighborhood's unofficial historian and Karenologist. Ah, he said, his voice full of grim sympathy. You've been Weatherly Ed. It's a rite of passage, my friend. Welcome to the club. She's really doing this, over a kiln. Leo, let me tell you about Karen Weatherly, Dave said, and I could practically hear him leaning back in his ergonomic office chair. She once tried to get my kid's treehouse condemned because the wood stain wasn't on the pre-approved list of earth tones, said it clashed with the seasonal foliage. She tried to get the city to ban ice cream trucks because the music violated the noise ordinance. She is the reason we have a bylaw about the maximum allowable height of a decorative lawn flamingo. The woman is relentless. So what do? I asked, feeling a genuine sense of despair. I can't just stop. This is my sanity, man. It's the only thing keeping me from applying for a job as a professional TV watcher. I don't know, Dave admitted. The HOA is like a tiny, petty government. They have the rules on their side, no matter how stupid they are. But they mostly have rules about business. They're obsessed with people running businesses out of their homes. Are you running a business? A business? I laughed humorlessly. Dude, I've made exactly $0 from this. I give most of the pots away. It's a hobby. A very expensive, very loud hobby. Well, there you go, he said, though he didn't sound very convinced. Just tell them it's not a business. We talked for a few more minutes, but the core of the problem remained. Dave's question echoed in my mind after I hung up. Are you running a business? No, I wasn't. But the HOA, in its infinite beige wisdom, didn't care about the distinction between commerce and passion. They saw a weird metal thing, they heard a whoosh, and they smelled a lawsuit. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cease and desist letter sat on my counter, mocking me. I paced my living room, the glow of my laptop screen casting long shadows, as I scrolled through the entire 87-page Maple Creek Estates HOA bylaws document. It was a torturous read. A document seemingly written by a committee of lawyers who were being paid by the word. But Dave's question kept nagging at me. Business. Commercial enterprise. Sale of goods. The words appeared over and over. They had rules for everything. Rules about sheds, rules about fences, rules about political signs, but they were all centered around maintaining a non-commercial, residential utopia. My anger began to curdle, transforming from a hot, bubbling rage into a cold, hard knot of defiance. Karen and her beige brigade wanted to take away the one thing that brought me joy, the one thing I was good at. They wanted to shut me down with their rule book. Fine. Two could play at that game. My eyes fell on a stack of cheap printer paper next to my laptop. An idea began to form. It was a terrible idea. It was a glorious idea. It was a petty, passive-aggressive, and utterly brilliant idea. A slow, mischievous grin spread across my face. She wants to shut down my business? I thought, the plan crystallizing in my mind with perfect, beautiful clarity. Fine. She wins. This isn't a business. What if it's a community service? What if it's a club? A free educational workshop? There's no rule against teaching. There's no rule against sharing your passion with your neighbors. There's definitely no rule against a community art project. And where was the perfect, most visible, most disruptive, and most technically within the rules place to host this little community gathering? Not in my backyard, where it could be hidden. Oh no, it was going to be right on my driveway, every single Saturday. I grabbed a pen and a piece of paper, my heart pounding with the thrill of malicious compliance. I started sketching, the skills from my old graphic design job coming back to me in a rush of spiteful creativity. I knew exactly what the flyer needed to say. It was a headline born of pure, unadulterated genius. The next morning, I felt like a teenage punk again, armed not with a can of spray paint, but with a stack of 50 neon yellow flyers hot off my inkjet printer. The design was deliberately, cheerfully obnoxious. I'd used a bubbly, rounded font called Joyful Celebration, and a little clip art cartoon of a flaming pot. But it was the headline, printed in huge, bold letters, that was my masterstroke. Karen complained about my pottery kiln. The sub-headline was even better. So I'm now offering free Raku firing classes on my driveway. Come make art. Annoy the HOA. Saturdays, 10 a.m. All are welcome. No experience necessary, just a tolerance for fire and petty suburban drama. I put on my sneakers and, with a giddy sense of purpose, made my rounds. I tacked a flyer to the corkboard at the local coffee shop, right over a notice for a lost cat. I stapled one to the community bulletin board at the park entrance. I tucked one under the windshield wiper of a particularly large minivan. I walked the length of Snapdragon Lane, a suburban revolutionary, posting my little yellow manifestos on lampposts. My final stop was 112 Snapdragon Lane. I didn't put one in her mailbox. That's a federal offense, and my rebellion had to be strictly legal. Instead, I let the flyer slip from my grasp, allowing a gentle breeze to carry it across her perfect, chemically treated lawn, where it came to rest like a defiant dandelion in a pristine golf green. I saw a curtain twitch in her front window. Mission accomplished. By the time I got home, my phone was already buzzing. The neighborhood Facebook group, a digital space normally reserved for arguing about dog poop and recommending plumbers, had exploded. Someone had posted a photo of my flyer with the caption, "OMG, you guys, it's happening." The comments were a glorious mix of amusement, shock, and pure, unadulterated glee. This is the most exciting thing to happen in Maple Creek since the great raccoon in the dumpster incident of '09. My kids would love this. Are you serious? It's really free? I'm just here for the drama. Making a bowl would be a bonus. Then, the direct messages started. The first was from a woman named Sarah. Her profile picture showed her being climbed by 3 small, sticky-looking boys. Her message read, "Hi, I live on Primrose Court. I saw your flyer. I have 3 sons under the age of 8. I desperately need to smash something and then make it beautiful. Can I please come?" The next was from a profile with a black and white photo of a raven. The username was Chloe Nightshade. The message, "This is hilariously punk rock. I'm so in. Do you have black glaze?" And then a message that made my heart ache a little. It was from an older gentleman, a man I recognized from his daily walks around the block. "Hello, my name is Arthur Henderson. I saw your notice at the park. I'm recently retired, and my wife passed away last year. I'm looking for a way to get out of the house. Would an old fellow like me be welcome?" I replied yes to all of them. I looked at the list of names growing on my notepad. Sarah, the frazzled mom. Chloe, the teenage goth. Mr. Henderson, the lonely widower. My little act of spite was attracting a strange and wonderful collection of people. I suddenly realized that I had no idea how to actually teach a class. I had no curriculum, no lesson plan, and barely enough clay for 5 people, let alone the 10 who had now confirmed. I had intended to poke the bear. It looked like I had accidentally started a circus. And I was the terrified, unqualified ringmaster. That first Saturday morning felt like the lead-up to a battle. I was up at dawn, dragging Bertha from the backyard to the edge of my driveway, setting up a folding table, and arranging my motley collection of tools and glazes. My stomach was a knot of anxiety and exhilaration. Was anyone actually going to show up? Or worse, was everyone going to show up? At 9:55 a.m., I had my answer. They came. Sarah arrived first, herding her 3 sons who immediately began treating my lawn as their personal Thunderdome. Chloe slouched up next, dressed head to toe in black, a stark contrast to the relentless morning sun. Then came Mr. Henderson, punctual as a Swiss watch, wearing a neat plaid shirt and a hopeful expression. A few other curious neighbors trickled in, drawn by the promise of free art and high drama. Soon, I had a chaotic assembly of about 10 people milling around on my driveway. "Okay, hi," I started, clapping my hands together awkwardly. "Welcome to, the thing. The Raku Rebellion? I don't know, we'll workshop the name. Who wants to get their hands dirty?" What followed was 2 hours of beautiful, unmitigated chaos. The kids, bless their hearts, were more interested in drawing on the concrete with lumps of wet clay than making actual pots. Sarah attacked her lump of clay with a vengeance, kneading it with a focused fury that was both terrifying and inspiring. Chloe meticulously crafted a small, perfectly formed skull. Mr. Henderson, a retired engineer, asked wonderfully precise questions about tensile strength and thermal dynamics that I was completely unqualified to answer. I was in way over my head, running around like a headless chicken, trying to show a 7-year-old how to make a pinch pot while simultaneously explaining the chemical composition of a copper glaze to Mr. Henderson. My internal monologue was a high-speed train of pure panic. Don't let the kid eat the clay. Make sure everyone knows the glaze is basically glass and not finger paint. Dear God, I have to light a fire in front of all these people. Then came the main event. It was time to fire up Bertha. "Okay, everybody, stand back," I announced, my voice cracking slightly. "This is where the magic happens." I cranked the valve. Whoosh! Bertha sprang to life with her signature roar. A collective gasp went through my small crowd. They watched, mesmerized, as I carefully loaded their lopsided, wonderful creations into the kiln. The heat was intense, the noise a constant rumble. For the first time all morning, there was a hushed silence on my driveway. The only sound was the dragon's breath of the kiln. Across the street, I saw Karen's blinds twitch. I was just pulling the first red-hot piece from the kiln, one of Sarah's furious yet charming bowls, tongs steady, sweat dripping down my face, when a new sound cut through the air. It wasn't the roar of the kiln. It was the quiet, authoritative purr of a V8 engine. A police cruiser was rolling slowly down Snapdragon Lane. It came to a stop right at the end of my driveway, its blue and red lights painting the scene in silent, strobing flashes. The class fell silent. Everyone froze. From across the street, Karen's front door opened, and she stood on her porch, arms crossed, a smug, triumphant look on her face. She had called in the cavalry. 2 officers got out. One was young, with a fresh haircut and a crisp uniform that looked like it had never seen a real crisis. This was Officer Miller, and he looked confused. The other was older, probably in his late 50s, with a mustache that had seen things and a deep, profound weariness in his eyes. This was Sergeant Davis. He looked like he would rather be literally anywhere else in the universe. Sergeant Davis ambled up the driveway, his eyes taking in the whole absurd tableau. The roaring kiln, the crowd of people holding muddy pots, the chalk drawings on the pavement, and me standing there in a scorched apron, holding a glowing hot bowl with a pair of giant tongs. He stopped a few feet away, pushing his hat back on his head. "Son," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone of exhaustion. "We got a call about a public disturbance involving fire and ceramics?" "It's an art class, Sergeant," I said, trying to sound casual, as if this was a perfectly normal Saturday. Totally free, community outreach, building neighborhood bonds. From her porch, Karen's voice cut across the lawn. "It's a public nuisance. He's a menace. He's endangering the entire neighborhood with that contraption." Sergeant Davis didn't even glance at her. He kept his tired eyes on me. "Are you selling anything here, son?" "Nope," I said, shaking my head. "Strictly educational. Non-profit. The pursuit of artistic expression." The younger cop, Miller, piped up, consulting a small notepad. "Sir, City Ordinance 34B states that any open flame requires a permit if used for commercial purposes." I looked him straight in the eye. "Is the pursuit of happiness a commercial purpose, officer?" Sergeant Davis let out a long, suffering sigh and rubbed his temples. I think I was giving him a headache. "Look," he said finally, his voice full of resignation. "As long as you have a fire extinguisher." I pointed to the large red extinguisher propped against my garage. "You're not blocking the public road, and nobody is actively on fire. This is a civil matter between you and your homeowners association. It's not our problem." He turned to his young partner. "Miller, it's not our problem." Then he looked back at me. "Try to keep the whooshing to a respectable level, okay?" With that, they turned around, got back in their cruiser, and drove away. The class, which had been holding its collective breath, erupted in cheers. Someone actually applauded. I felt like a conquering hero. Chloe was filming the whole thing on her phone, a wide, genuine grin on her face. Across the street, Karen stared in disbelief for a moment before slamming her front door with a resounding crack that echoed down the street. It was a small battle, but it was a major victory. The Raku rebellion was real, and it was officially, begrudgingly, on the right side of the law. The classes became a fixture of life on Snapdragon Lane. Every Saturday morning, my driveway transformed from a boring slab of concrete into a bustling open-air art studio. The core group of regulars, Sarah, Chloe, Mr. Henderson, became my lieutenants, helping newcomers, explaining the basics, and generally managing the happy chaos. Sarah, I learned, was a former project manager, and she quickly took to organizing the glaze station with terrifying efficiency. Chloe became our official documentarian, her TikToks of our suburban art rebellion gaining a small but devoted following. Mr. Henderson appointed himself the official greeter and morale officer, ensuring everyone felt welcome. We were forming a strange, wonderful little community. Sarah was visibly less stressed, channeling her maternal energy into her art instead of just her kids. Chloe was opening up, sharing her dark, witty sense of humor and proving to have a ridiculously keen eye for design. Mr. Henderson was the heart of the group, telling stories about his late wife, Martha, who had been a painter, and how our messy little class was the most color he'd had in his life in over a year. But the rebellion was taking a toll on my infrastructure, namely my driveway, which now looked like a Jackson Pollock painting that had been run over by a truck. It was perpetually stained with ash, carbon, and rogue splotches of glaze. I was also burning through my savings at an alarming rate, buying clay and propane for a dozen people every week. If this was going to continue, I needed a better setup. I needed to move the operation off the driveway and into a more permanent, dedicated space in the backyard. I needed a studio, or more accurately, a kiln gazebo. I found a loophole in the HOA bylaws, a beautiful, glorious loophole. Accessory structures under 120 square feet, it read, do not require pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee. My plan was simple. Build a 119.5 square foot fortress of clay in my backyard. This, however, required a professional. I found a local contractor named Gus, a burly, barrel-chested man whose online reviews all said some version of not cheap, but gets it done. Gus showed up in a mud-splattered Ford F-150, took one look at my backyard setup, and grunted. "So," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you're the pottery guy." "The very same," I said proudly. He walked a slow circle around Bertha, eyeing her with a professional skepticism. "And you want to pour a concrete slab and build a, what did you call it on the phone? A kiln gazebo?" "Exactly," I said, unrolling a crude sketch I'd made. "Open air on 3 sides so it meets fire code for ventilation, but with a proper roof to keep the rain out. And a nice, solid privacy wall on this side," I said, gesturing pointedly towards Karen Weatherly's house. "A very, very solid wall." Gus stroked his thick beard, a glint in his eye. "You got HOA approval for this?" "I have a loophole that says any structure under 120 square feet is my own damn business," I said, paraphrasing slightly. "We're building this bad boy to be 119.5 square feet of pure, unadulterated, technically legal freedom." A slow, wide grin spread across Gus's face. He clapped me on the shoulder with a hand the size of a cinder block. "I like you, kid. You've got moxie. Let me get my tape measure. We're gonna make this thing spite-proof." The project began the following week. Gus and his crew were loud, efficient, and thoroughly disruptive. They tore up my lawn, poured a perfect concrete slab, and began erecting the frame of my little gazebo. It was an investment. A real, tangible, this is not a joke investment of money I barely had into a feud I had started out of pure pettiness. The stakes were officially raised. And across the street, The curtains at 112 Snapdragon Lane were twitching with what I could only imagine was apocalyptic rage. The tipping point came on a bright, sunny Saturday, about a month into our weekly rebellion. Chloe's TikToks had been doing surprisingly well. Her video of the police visiting us, set to the song Bad Boys, had over 50,000 views. A local influencer, a food blogger who went by Cincy Eats a Lot, shared it on her Instagram story. Apparently, her cousin was a producer at the local news station. That's how, in the middle of a class, a white van with the Channel 5 logo on the side pulled up to my curb. A perky, immaculately dressed young reporter named Cindy hopped out, followed by a world-weary cameraman who looked like he'd rather be covering a 5-alarm fire. "Leo Maxwell?" Cindy asked, extending a microphone toward me. "I'm Cindy from Channel 5 News. We heard there was a story here?" My heart did a backflip. We were going on the news. The Raku rebellion was about to be televised. The resulting segment, which aired that night between a story about a prize-winning pumpkin and the weekend weather forecast, was a masterpiece of local news schmaltz. It was also absolutely perfect. It opened with a dramatic shot of me, visor down, pulling a glowing pot from Bertha, the cameraman using a zoom lens to make it look like I was wrestling with the sun itself. "In the quiet suburb of Maple Creek," Cindy's voiceover began, "one man's passion for a fiery, ancient art form has sparked a neighborhood feud and an unlikely community." They cut to an interview with me. I was a sweaty, stammering mess, completely blinded by the camera light. "Well," I said, trying to sound cool and articulate, "when life gives you lemons, sometimes you have to build a giant kiln on your driveway and teach your neighbors ceramics for free, you know?" It sounded much dumber on camera than it had in my head. But then they interviewed my students, and they were the real stars. "This class is my therapy," Sarah said, holding up a beautifully glazed, albeit slightly lopsided, fruit bowl. Her 3 boys were visible in the background, engaged in a dirt clod fight. "It's cheaper than a psychiatrist, and I get a bowl out of it. It's a win-win." Then they cut to Mr. Henderson. He got a little emotional, his voice thick as he spoke. "Since my Martha passed, this house got very quiet. This is the first time in a long time I've felt like I was a part of something. These people," he said, gesturing to the motley group behind him, "they're my friends." The segment ended with a wide shot of all of us, holding up our creations, smiling and waving at the camera like a bunch of goofs. They never mentioned Karen by name, but they didn't have to. The narrative was clear. A quirky local artist was building a community, and one grumpy, unseen neighbor was trying to stop him. The story aired at 6:15 p.m. By 6:20 p.m., my phone was melting. Texts, Facebook messages, Instagram follows. People from all over the city were messaging me, cheering me on. My little act of spite had made me a minor local folk hero. It felt like the ultimate victory. The war was won. I had triumphed through the sheer power of art and petty compliance. I was, of course, an idiot. I hadn't won the war. I had just given my enemy an atomic bomb. Public humiliation, it turns out, is a powerful motivator. For Karen Weatherly, seeing her neighborhood portrayed on the evening news as a quirky artist's haven, with her implicitly cast as the villain, was not a defeat. It was a call to arms. The war was no longer about fumes or property values. It was about scorched earth, no prisoners, existential vengeance. 3 days after the news story aired, the other shoe dropped. It didn't drop with a thud. It arrived with the quiet, professional footsteps of a process server. I was in my kitchen, trying to figure out how to pay for the lumber Gus needed for the gazebo roof, when there was a sharp knock on the door. It wasn't Karen this time. It was a bored-looking man in a cheap suit holding a thick manila envelope. "Leo Maxwell?" he asked without emotion. "That's me." "You've been served," he said, thrusting the envelope into my hands. He turned and walked away before I could even process what had happened. I closed the door, my hands trembling slightly. This felt different. The cream-colored HOA letter had been annoying. This felt menacing. I tore open the envelope. The document inside wasn't from the HOA. It was from the prestigious-sounding law firm of Weatherly, Abernathy, and Finch. I had a sinking feeling I knew which Weatherly that was. I was being sued. Personally. I collapsed onto my couch and read the lawsuit. It was a work of art, a symphony of legal threats and accusations. Karen, through her high-powered lawyer husband, of course her husband was a lawyer, was seeking a permanent injunction to halt all my pottery-related activities. The complaint was 12 pages long. I was accused of creating a public nuisance, of violating obscure city zoning ordinances I'd never heard of, and of operating a de facto community center in a single-family residential zone. There was a whole section on how the noxious fumes and alarming pyrotechnics had caused severe and ongoing emotional distress to both Karen and Bartholomew, the Shih Tzu, who was now apparently afraid of the backyard and required canine therapy. They even included a sworn affidavit from another neighbor, old Mr. Gable, the one whose birdhouse she'd gotten condemned, claiming the weekly gathering of people and cars was disruptive. She had turned my one-time ally against me. The final pages outlined the financial damages she was seeking for the alleged decrease in her property's value and for Bartholomew's psychological trauma. The number had a lot of zeros. The fun was over. The game was over. This wasn't about spite and loopholes anymore. This was about lawyers and money. Two things I was critically short on. I couldn't afford to fight this. I couldn't afford to lose it. I looked out the window at Gus's half-finished gazebo frame, a monument to my own hubris. Bertha sat cold and silent on the new concrete slab. For the first time since this whole ridiculous war began, I felt completely and utterly defeated. The Raku rebellion, it seemed, was over. That Saturday, the mood on my driveway was less like a party and more like a wake. Only the core group showed up: Sarah, Chloe, and Mr. Henderson. I broke the news to them, spreading the lawsuit out on the folding table like a death certificate. "She's suing me," I said, my voice flat. "Personally, for a ridiculous amount of money. I have to stop. I'm sorry, guys. It was fun while it lasted, but I can't fight this." A heavy silence fell over our little group. Sarah picked up the papers, her project manager eyes scanning the dense legal text. Chloe stared at the ground, kicking at a stray piece of dried clay. Mr. Henderson just looked sad. His shoulders slumped. This thing that had brought us all together was being dismantled by a woman and her traumatized Shih Tzu. "This is utter crap," Sarah finally said, slamming the papers back down on the table. "Emotional distress to a dog? A de facto community center? This is just bullying." "It's legal bullying, though," I said with a sigh. "And I can't afford the cover charge for that club." "So that's it?" Chloe asked, looking up, her voice sharper than usual. "You're just going to let her win? The final boss, Karen, as my TikTok followers call her, just gets to crush the rebellion?" "I don't have a choice," I said, feeling my own frustration rising. "What am I supposed to do?" What happened next, I never could have predicted. My little group of misfits didn't just offer sympathy, they offered a battle plan. "Wait," Sarah said, pulling out her phone. My sister-in-law is a paralegal at a downtown firm. She specializes in nuisance complaints. Let me send her a picture of this lawsuit. She owes me for a decade of babysitting her monstrous children. This is ridiculous." Chloe, meanwhile, was already typing furiously on her own phone. "No way. This is not how it ends. I'm starting a GoFundMe. I'll call it the Leo's Legal Defense and Pizza Fund. The internet loves this stuff. A dude getting sued over a free art class? It's perfect. I'll post it with the news story. #Save the Kiln." Before I could even respond, Mr. Henderson, who had been quiet until now, straightened his shoulders. "I'm going to go door to door," he announced, his voice firm. "I'll make a petition. I guarantee you there are more people in this neighborhood who like what you're doing than who agree with her. She can have her sworn affidavit from poor Mr. Gable. I'll get 100 signatures." Just then my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Heard you were in trouble, kid. It's Gus." I stared at the screen. How did he even know? My phone rang. It was him. I put it on speaker. "Gus?" "Yeah, kid," his gruff voice rumbled through the phone. "My wife saw your sob story on the Facebook group. Listen, this Weatherly broad sounds like a real piece of work. Tell..." "You what? My cousin, Vinny? He's a zoning lawyer, bit of a shark, but he owes me a favor after I rebuilt his deck last year. Let's see what a real lawyer thinks of this emotional distress for a dog garbage. Also, I'm dropping off the rest of the rebar on Monday. We're finishing that gazebo, lawsuit or no lawsuit. No charge for the labor." I was speechless. I looked around at the three faces in front of me. Sarah, already on the phone with her sister-in-law. Chloe, designing a GoFundMe campaign graphic. Mr. Henderson, mentally plotting his petition route. Gus, on the phone, offering free labor and legal counsel from a guy named Vinny. I had started this whole thing out of pure, unadulterated spite. I wanted to annoy my neighbor, but somewhere along the way, without me even realizing it, it had become something else. Something real. It wasn't my fight anymore. It was ours. And we weren't going down without firing up the kiln one more time. The emergency HOA meeting was held on a Tuesday night at the bland, fluorescent-lit community center. It felt like a war council. On one side of the room sat Karen Weatherly, her lawyer husband, and a few of her stern-faced allies, including a reluctant-looking Mr. Gable. They had binders full of bylaws, complaints, and photos of my driveway. On our side, it was a beautiful motley crew. There was me, in my nicest, non-clay-stained shirt. Next to me was Gus's cousin Vinny, a short, sharp-eyed man in a suit that was just a little too shiny. Behind us sat Sarah, Chloe, Mr. Henderson, and about 20 other neighbors and class attendees. They came armed not with binders, but with their favorite pottery pieces, which they placed in front of them like colorful ceramic shields. The meeting was called to order by the HOA president, a man named Bob, who looked like he'd rather be having a root canal. Karen's lawyer husband, a man whose face seemed permanently frozen in a condescending smirk, spoke first. He was smooth, professional, and boring. He droned on about zoning laws, liability, insurance, and the sanctity of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Karen then gave a short, impassioned speech about maintaining community standards, protecting their financial investment, and the peaceful tranquility that had been shattered by my constant industrial noise. Then it was our turn. Vinny went first, politely and methodically dismantling their legal arguments with the casual expertise of a master butcher. He pointed out that the zoning ordinance they cited was for commercial operations, which, thanks to the 50 signatures on Mr. Henderson's petition attesting to the free nature of the classes, we could prove this wasn't. Then Bob, the HOA president, looked at me. "Mr. Maxwell, do you have anything to say?" My heart was pounding. Vinny had handled the law. Now it was up to me to handle the hearts and minds. I stood up, my hands shaking so much I shoved them in my pockets. Hi, I began, my voice squeaking. "I don't have a binder. I don't have a lawyer. Well, I do now, thanks, Vinny. But I'm not gonna lie. This whole thing started because I was mad. I was being petty. My neighbor didn't like my kiln, and I acted like a jerk about it." I glanced at Karen, who looked momentarily surprised. "But then," I continued, finding my rhythm, "something weird happened. People started showing up. Sarah over there, who I think we can all agree is a superhero for raising her 3 boys, started showing up. Chloe, who is way cooler than I will ever be, started showing up. Mr. Henderson, who has lived on Snapdragon Lane longer than I've been alive, started showing up. And it stopped being about me and my fight. It became about us." I gestured to the crowd behind me. "We're not a nuisance. We're neighbors. Actually talking to each other. Making stuff. Making a mess. We're being a community, which from what I've seen, is a pretty rare and valuable thing around here." I sat down, my face flushed. I thought I might have blown it. But then Sarah stood up. She talked about how the class was the 1 hour a week she felt like herself. Not just a mom. Then Chloe stood, talking about how she'd found a creative outlet and a place she didn't feel judged. The final decisive blow came from Mr. Henderson. He stood slowly, holding up a small, beautifully flawed Raku tea bowl, its surface a chaotic swirl of iridescent blue and smoky black. "My wife, Martha, and we lived at 124 Snapdragon for 42 years, he began, his voice quiet but clear, commanding the attention of the entire room. "We saw this neighborhood get built. When she passed last year, this house got very quiet. It's amazing how quiet a house can be. For months, the only person I spoke to most days was the mailman." He paused, looking down at the bowl in his hands. "Then this young man started making a racket with his fire machine." A few people chuckled, breaking the tension. "And he invited all of us over. He put a silly flyer on a lamppost. This bowl, it's the first thing I've made with my own 2 hands since I built a crib for my son in 1978. It's crooked. It's got a crack in it. But it's mine. We did this, together." He looked directly at the HOA board. "This isn't about property values. It's about a community's value. And I, for one, think what Leo Maxwell has been doing, as loud and messy as it is, has made this neighborhood a much richer place to live." He sat down. The room was utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Karen and her husband were staring, speechless. The emotional weight of Mr. Henderson's testimony had crushed their binders of bylaws. The war wasn't about the rules anymore. It was about what was right. The HOA board voted. It wasn't a total victory, but it was the only one that mattered. They brokered a compromise. Karen's lawsuit was meritless, and she was strongly encouraged to drop it. I could continue my classes, but I had to agree to a few reasonable conditions. Classes would end by 6 p.m., I'd limit the size to a manageable number, and I had to complete Gus's Kiln gazebo with all the proper safety features, which was already happening. We agreed. It was over. We had won. Our side of the room erupted in quiet cheers and hugs. Karen and her husband gathered their binders and slipped out of the room without a word. The next afternoon, the world felt different, quieter. I was in my front yard, picking up a few stray bits of clay, when I saw her. Karen was across the street, on her hands and knees, weeding her petunia bed with a ferocious, vengeful energy. I don't know what came over me. Maybe it was the relief. Maybe it was Mr. Henderson's speech still ringing in my ears. But on an impulse, I went into my house and picked up the best piece I'd ever made. It was a tall, elegant vase from my last firing, the one where the carbon and copper had reacted just right, creating a finish that looked like a captured nebula. I walked across the street. She didn't look up until I was standing right beside her. My shadow fell over her petunias. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice clipped, not unkind, but not friendly either. Just tired. "Hey," I said, I made this. I thought you might like it." I held out the vase. She finally looked up from her weeds, her eyes falling on the piece in my hands. For a single, fleeting second, her mask of suburban hostility cracked. I saw a flicker of something else. Appreciation, maybe? She saw the art, not just the apparatus. The expression was gone as quickly as it came. "I can't accept that," she said, turning back to her petunias. "Okay," I said with a small nod. "Well, the offer's there. Have a good day, Karen." I didn't call her Mrs. Weatherly. I called her Karen. I gently placed the vase on the manicured edge of her lawn, a strange sort of peace offering. Then I turned and walked back to my own imperfect yard. A truce hadn't exactly been called, but maybe, just maybe, the fighting was over. A month later, my backyard was transformed. The kiln gazebo was finished, a sturdy, handsome structure of cedar and corrugated metal. It was my temple of mud and fire. The classes were smaller now, more organized. Sarah had become my unofficial co-teacher, her project manager skills finally being put to good use. Chloe was managing our Instagram page, at Raku Rebellion, which now had over 1,000 followers. Mr. Henderson still came every week, though he spent more time telling stories and drinking coffee than making pots. He was our heart. The GoFundMe had paid for Vinny's, heavily discounted, legal fees, the rest of the gazebo materials, and a whole lot of celebratory pizza. I was still broke, but for the first time in a long time, I was genuinely happy. I wasn't just a laid-off graphic designer anymore. I was a teacher, a community organizer, the slightly less terrified ringmaster of a wonderful, weird circus. That Saturday, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, I was helping Mr. Henderson with a glaze technique. The kiln was cooling with a series of gentle pings and ticks. I glanced across the lawn, over the fence, towards 112 Snapdragon Lane. Through her large front window, lit by the warm glow of a lamp inside, I could just make out something on her mantelpiece. It was tall and elegant, its surface shimmering with deep blues and coppers, catching the light just so. It was the vase. I smiled. A real, honest-to-God smile. I guess I won, I thought to myself. But it doesn't really feel like I beat Karen. It feels like we all just built something instead. And to think, it all started because one woman, one glorious, terrifying, beige pantsuit-wearing woman, really, really hated my kiln. God bless her, I thought, turning back to my friends. And God bless Bartholomew, the easily frightened Shih Tzu. Without them, I'd probably still just be a lonely guy making pots in his backyard. Now I'm the guy who accidentally started a cult. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way.